Well, I'm gonna give this a shot. So, welcome everybody to the second half of Seven Pillars of Wisdom. I just threw on the recording, and I wanted to tell you guys a change. Somewhere along the way, we've always decided that we were gonna record these, but I think the original intent was for them to be only played inside of the network. And at some point, I put them up on a blog and made them more public. And I don't know what I was thinking there. I that was never my intention, and I wanted to make sure that if this book club is open to anybody, but you should be able to have a conversation either knowing who's like on the call with you or who's listening. Because I think that sometimes we talk about books that are kind of pushing the envelope, and so I want to apologize for putting that up there. I hadn't really thought about it. One of you guys brought it up with me, and I was like, you know what? I didn't even think of it that way. So the reason I bring all that up is because we just got done reading what I think was one of the most intense books I've ever read in my life, where it is talking about the actual core of civilization and fighting for the way things will be, or who is your master. And so for me, this was a shocking book, an enthralling book, a book that made me wonder, should I be out there crossing mountains and deserts too? And one that made me really question the value of going to war, and the true cost of understanding what happens when people come into conflict and they're willing to fight to the death over it. So for me, this was an amazing book, and I could not be any more excited to be talking with other people who trekked across the desert. I know some people didn't finish it, which is no big deal. If you rode on those camels, if you went a long time without water, if you were engaged in this thing, you went through an adventure, and I'm really excited to talk with everybody about it. So, to begin, why don't we just do a quick round robin since everybody's on here? Did you read the book all the way through? Did you listen to it? And what were your kind of initial thoughts? And also, how far did you get through it? Knowing not everybody made it through, no big deal. We'll start with you, Lyle. What's up?
So I made it through the first half, and we did our book club, and I started on the next few hundred pages, and then I don't know where the month went, but it just disappeared. And so I jumped in. I was trying to quickly do a university style cramming at the end of the book to get caught up, and I didn't quite get there. So I'm at about chapter 109, I think, and apparently I haven't quite got to the final climatic scene that we're about to hit. So I'm interested in what the take is on the end of the book. And I did read the whole book, I did. My experience is all reading. I haven't listened to any of it.
Mike, how about you?
I checked. Got to 105. Didn't read the whole thing.
And your initial thoughts?
Oh, I enjoyed the book. I mean, as far as the experiences of the war and the people in it, and the freak across the desert and all those things, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed what I read.
Brian.
Yeah, I guess I listened to the whole book on and off while I was feeding. I kind of waited for the last week to kind of listen to it so it's fresh in my head. Really, I was kind of felt let down the last book of it. The last like 3 chapters I didn't think were as eventful. Kind of it just played back on some of the other things, but the biggest thing that kind of got me, I think it was chapter 103. I had typed in AVN, but the biggest thing was he talked about he likes to do a little bit of everything, whether he's not perfect at it. It's better to have it done and imperfect done than to not have done it at all. And I think that was later, maybe 105 or something chapters, if I remember right. But that's one that kind of really struck me. It was kind of the core of the whole thing. He did as best as he could through the whole time over there with what he had, and he made it on less than what a lot of people thought was needed.
Right on. Rob.
Yeah, I started reading it. I had the weird 8.5 by 11 format book, which is like the size of a textbook, and single, one giant column, 800 miles long. So my eyes rapidly became exhausted by this, and I ended up getting the audiobook, and I listened probably right to, I think 104, 105 is about where I'm at. So
Right on, Christina.
So the first half of the book I listened to and kind of followed along on the paper copy, and I started the second half earlier this week, but I pretty much for 10 hours today listened to an audiobook, and AJ made fun of me the whole entire time. But there were some parts in that book that were really grotesque, like the head popping, like that still is, that line stuck with me. Don't want to know what a human brain sounds like exploding, but so yeah, there were a lot of camels, and I think that it would have been almost entertaining if you kept track of them along the way, plus or minus how many camels they went through. But there were definitely, it was a voyage.
Miriam.
I actually did finish it about 2 weeks ago. I decided I was going to just plow through. I read like 30 to 50 pages a day for a couple weeks there at the beginning of the month. And I enjoyed the second half much more than the first half, partially, I think, because I felt like things were happening faster, but also partially because after our first book club discussion, I was able to look for a lot more patterns and extract more value out of it. I don't remember a lot of specific things now that it's been a couple weeks, and it was definitely one of those books that I finished it, but there was a lot that I didn't take the time to actually comprehend everything. But I still think I'm still glad that I read it, and I'm glad that this club challenged me to read it. And I read the paper copy the whole time.
Tom, we're doing a quick round robin and kind of saying, did you listen to the book? Did you read the book? Did you get all the way through it? And kind of your first initial thoughts.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I pounded through it. The second half was audiobook for me. It just worked well. I could be milking cows and listening to the book at the same time. So the second half took care of all the questions I had about the first half and brought up a couple more for me. I understand why he was doing it the way he was doing it as far as his commitment, and some new questions that arise that I'll have some questions tonight are how he thinks of himself and how he carried that through the entire book. It was pretty interesting to me.
Absolutely. I actually had a chance to talk with Rob for a little bit today, and I made the point about his thoughts on what his role was here is the thing that redeemed him in my eyes, but it's definitely worth the discussion. So, Joseph, I know you're driving. It's up to you. If you unmute, we'll let you talk, and if not, we understand you got work you're doing right now.
Yeah, I skipped around a lot. I didn't read the whole thing, but I enjoyed parts of it, but it hasn't been my favorite. I was kind of like the last time. I'm looking forward to seeing it.
Well, let's kick it off here and start with Tom's question, which is a great place to start. What do you think about how he thought of himself in this book? And if you didn't finish, take what you know. Don't worry at all. Don't let that hesitate, and we'll just have a discussion about it. But how did you think he thought about himself in this situation?
Were you going to me, Vance?
Anybody. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, so I thought he was very much a masochist. I think he enjoyed the pain and the hardship of what he was doing, and it was the end goal for him to be able to finish the war and have some honor. And I didn't realize that till the very end of the book. But it was surprising to me when he was captured and he was going through that torture, that it's almost like he somehow enjoyed it. And he probably enjoyed it because he was able to get away. But I would think that kind of torture would crush most humans. And he took it and was still planning on, had a clear mind on how to get away. It was never his intention to give up even through that. He somehow enjoys the pain and thrives on it. And the desert environment was very much that, pain.
Yeah, I think he had a good point where any obstacle came up, and it kind of goes back to where he said he'd rather do whatever he could, even though it wasn't perfect. And I think that pain was a part of it. You know, he knew it wasn't perfect, so he just trudged through and kept on. And I was really surprised at the end, kind of how he talked about himself, how he didn't know kind of what side to be on. As when I was listening, it sounded like he wanted to be more on the Arab side and not so much his homeland, but he was also still tied to do what he could for them. So he was kind of a torn man between two different worlds, the one he's lived for the last, whatever it was, 2 or 3 years.
There's a really interesting duality there. I think it passes through the entire book, where he's constantly struggling with this. In the first half of the book, he knows what's coming. He's seen enough realpolitik and geopolitics of the way the English Empire works to know before it's even gonna happen what's gonna happen. And there's several places where he talks pretty deeply about worrying about getting the Arabs set up so that they are in a position that they can be more equal in dealing with the English and try to get a settlement that works in their favor. And it's really interesting to me how closely identified he has become with these Arabs. Probably even before the campaign. I think that was probably why he was the right person for leading this campaign, is because he was 100% focused on the Arabs and their issues and carrying them forward and helping them with it, rather than just coming in and telling them how to do it, or using the British Army to do most of the work and not give them a freedom that was an earned freedom.
When I was thinking, Tom, about your perspective about how he thought about himself and the burdens he was taking, I thought, who is the type of person that would go into a place in another land speaking another language with a totally different culture and be like, hey guys, let's go kill all these other people over there and then you can have your freedom. And like, I know he did it with a lot more finesse than that, but at its core, that's what he did. And that's like, it seems like a trait that you certainly wouldn't want to be very common in people.
Do you think it had anything to do with how he saw himself being knighted by the time he was 30, when he was having that reflection towards the end, that he knew the approach to get to his goal and it just blindly goes towards it, because that was the path to him achieving success in his mind? And even though he didn't feel like it was successful, or that's how I took it, it was an empty success at the end. He just put the blinders on and did what he needed to do because that's the only way he thought.
Yeah, when I didn't realize how young he was until the very, very, very end, when he was like, and I turned 30 in a year or something like that.
Yeah.
And I was like, holy shit. Like, had I been making those decisions, now I see why. The adventure and the excitement and the not connection to other people. Like, if you had a wife and children at home, you wouldn't be doing that stuff.
the interesting parallel in this is that what he was doing was really kind of the foundational work to what became here in the U.S. the Green Beret and the Special Forces, where it was going in and inciting a revolution and then helping the people achieve their own revolution and achieve their own success, however that looked, in whatever way that looked like. And so what he did here was really the template for what came later in probably the 40s and 50s in the U.S. and turned into what we know now as the Green Beret. So and that's the same thing. It's guys that are in their prime of their life. They're 20 to 30-year-old guys that are tasked with a national priority and sent to some other foreign land and told to use their best judgment and be good for the people, but also be good for the country they came from. So there's a really interesting foundational movement here in this.
You know, there was something that I wondered about was whether all the detail and all the descriptions and things like what Christina was talking about and the deprivation of food and water over time and the different struggles that he went through, whether writing all those things down and unloading that from his mind and putting it out in paper and putting all this down and journalizing it was a way to maintain sanity, so to speak, and to deal with the mental challenges that I'm sure he was having, coming out of the things that he described at times. Was it a survival tactic on his part so that he didn't become insane with some of the challenges he had?
There is a point where he starts talking about, I believe actually a couple of spots where he's talking about the strength of will,
Right.
that they would not like the weakness of the body to lead to the weakness of the will, that the will should just be indomitable. And I feel like that is the key that unlocks his character here in terms of, you could call it masochism, but I think it's just him, obtaining his will and knowing that nothing can stop him if he's, willing to devote his entire energies of his life to it, which it seems like is the message here.
There seems to be maybe a common thread in that period of literature that was there was, I don't know, kind of a cultural thing at that time in the late 1800s through maybe the 1920s or 30s, where that was a common. If you read diaries from that era, and so some of the literature from that era seems to be a really I will conquer my will. I will overcome all, and I'll bend my body to my will and to my mind. And I don't know if this is so much a unique thing as it is it was the cream that rose to the top out of the literature of that and the culture of that era. There's a book, I haven't read it yet, but I think it showed up in one of the nets here the other day. Kate might have mentioned it. That's Everest, Mallory, and did you see that, Vance or Rob? There's a three-part tripod or a trilogy that's about Mount Everest, Mallory, and I think the Great War or World War I somehow. That speaks a little more deeply to that particular piece of will and mind over body.
I don't recall that, but I'm interested in that.
I think it was in Bill Tall.
So I want to talk about my question that I had for other people was what chapter did you think the end of the book was, or really the end of the story? When did it wrap up? Did you require the epilogue for it to be like, now I see what they were trying to do all along? Or at what point were you like, I get what he was doing? Did any of you guys have a moment like that?
I think the biggest part for me was I don't have the book, but when I was listening to it, I think it's the last set of chapters in that last book. I didn't find a lot in that other than a few little details. But when he was talking a lot about, this is what I've done, why I've done it, and his reflecting back on his knighthood, and maybe that one part was towards the end there, but that kind of helped piece a little together. But I really, everybody needs to be able to do a little bit of everything and got to work together with these other people to make this end goal, even though, it was the two warring factions. He had already conquered all that. And that's where I thought it was kind of over. And the rest was just, hey, we're blowing up this railroad track. And now we're blowing up this next one. We're going to stop these guys, divide them, conquer. And so that's kind of where I thought kind of the end was, where there wasn't a lot of new introduced other than stuff we'd already went around before.
For me, the chapter right before the field hospital that Christina mentioned, which was just absolutely gruesome, there's a scene when they go into Damascus and they're deciding who's going to be in charge. And Faisal hasn't quite arrived yet, and this other guy basically says, "I'm in charge, and thanks for your help, but we're taking over now." And that was the most amazing just set of experiences where they're like, we've got to solve this part of the problem, then this one, and then we got to go take them out here, and we're going to invite them into this situation. And they had to use real force. Like, they got all the way to the end, and there might be some thugs that were just going to steal it from them. And then they had to figure out how to give them such a demonstration of force that they would back down entirely. That chapter was when I was like, this is how it all ties together, because what they're trying to become is the governing body there. And that was just a fascinating. The whole time that he was doing all the desert riding, I had no idea that that's what they were going for, but then it all made sense to me.
Yeah, but in that same scene, did you get the feeling that it was completely empty for him because of the way they dismissed him? The war was essentially done, and he was still putting forth maximum effort to help out the Arab cause. I mean, he's in that hospital he has no business being in, but he's the only one doing it. And they just dismissed him like he was nothing. And he is a major reason all those tribes hung in till the end. He's like the glue that kept those. I mean, how many miles of travel and how many tribes did he keep in the fight with him?
Yeah, and the last line of that chapter, when the guy says, I told him, he told me I could have leave, and that this would be better for their cause, and he agreed to me. And then I was sad. Like, it all dawned on him that yes, he could be dismissed from this, and then he's out of there and gone home. And how would you even go back to the regular world and be like, yeah, we just rode around on camels and we blew up trains and
Yeah, I thought of that. Like, how do you return to a normal life? Also, eating things that aren't camels and other types of meat. Also having to survive on limited water and different things like that, and then returning to a society where you could get water out of a tap. I don't know if any of you have ever traveled or maybe returned from a camping trip or something like that, where you have to get reacclimated to your culture. For me, traveling to Ecuador or Argentina, and being in remote areas and then coming back to the US was really culture shock. And I think the first trip I went on, they tried to prepare us for that, but I don't think they really did it justice until you experienced it yourself. So the second trip, I was way more prepared for it. But I don't know if anyone else has ever experienced that transition of
yeah, the return from the Peace
lifestyle.
Corps was that way for me. And I you know, I didn't have to then also be carrying the burden of, we shot all the Turkish people because they raped the village of my friend, and he went and rode down on his camel until they shot him to death on a martyr's mission, and then they went and killed, I don't know, hundreds or thousands of them. Like, I think you're right, Mike. I think he writes the book so that the confession is so far out into the open that nobody could ever claim he was trying to hide something, because like throughout the whole book he's making himself kind of the he's kind of the shit, but during that thing you're like, he let those people massacre those other people.
In the context of the time, though, the Turks had wiped out, I think, 270,000 Armenians at that point, but pretty directly. And so there, you know, if as you juggle this, who's right morality, there was the Turks were pretty evil people, and they kind of had what a lot of what they got was coming their way anyway. I think, you know, from a historical perspective, it's. But it is interesting, as Christine's point about what was it like to come back from this. I really wonder what that generation in the early 20s was like for an entire world of people that were coming back from the European war or this particular one or Gallipoli or different places. It had truly been a world war, and it had been a savage, brutal, bloody war. And so you have all these young men coming back that have seen half their unit get wiped out. And so they've got all this common experience. And yet, from what I've been able to piece together, those guys really didn't talk about it much, even to their brother soldiers that had shared that with them. It was, they tried to put it behind themselves when they came back to this sane world that didn't have explosives and guns and blood and all that. So, you know, it's amazing to me that society survived that transitional phase from having all these veterans come back, having seen what they saw, and be able to in some way reacclimate and become ultimately very functional members of society.
You look at what's going on in history at this time, it's also interesting to think about that they were pretty much right at peak empire at that point. Like there were new acquisitions post World War I, you know, the Mesopotamia and, you know, the Arab areas that they didn't give to Saudi Arabia, these spots, you know. And that was it after that, right? From there, it's downhill for the empire. It's India pops out in 48, and it all just starts coming apart after World War II. But between the wars, I feel like it was pretty much in, you know, it's kind of moving sideways. I don't know. I wonder if all of this has anything to do with it. If people lost their will to rule over these other populations around the world from actually having gone out and seen what that entails. But I feel like, I guess they've been doing that all along anyway. I don't know.
You know, this book and what we experienced in reading it and the detail involved and what happens during wars and battles, and the idea that, you know, that there was human people experiencing this at the scene one-on-one. And as modern warfare develops and has developed, where we don't have as much of that involvement with hand-to-hand combat, and as we move to more technological things for warfare, how much different will our society, or do we now, look at war? Because, you know, this happened in the early 1900s, and yes, we've had some since then, but you know, not maybe to the extent that we have in the past with this World War I, World War II. You know, it crossed my mind is, are we going to have these kind of catastrophic events and if you understand what I'm saying, how does it affect the societal development that goes along later in these particular war zones?
I think, Mike, that it depends on what regions conflicts arise in. The book got a lot more gruesome when we got to the part late in the book where the trench warfare came in, and it was no longer in the desert. And I guess I would compare trench warfare to a war like Korea or Vietnam, where they're dug in, and a lot of our technology isn't going to be effective, and you have to go to it. So I think that type of war will always exist. It just depends on where the conflict pops up.
I think a big thing too now is we're all so much more connected with all this social media, for the better or for worse, that you now see all these things happening elsewhere if you're trying to tap into them. Granted, you got to get out of your little bubble and your tribe and reach out to get to some of these different things, but everything's not as hidden as it used to be, where it's such a culture shock. And I think, the World War I, the war to end all wars until World War II, a lot of people thought it would never happen again. And then when it did happen, I think that really shocked a lot of people. And, all the little wars we've had since then, I think that's been in the back of everybody's mind, that we don't want another world war with all of our technologies we have now. Someone, could dust somebody in a push of a button.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the most interesting components when you think about the periods of time where they're fighting with people on camels with their swords, right? Like they were happy when they had long range guns, but that was not always what they had. It was just we aren't going to fight like that. The world will have to be radically different around here for us to get into a battle like that.
Where did all the camels come from? Like, how did they, then they got 2,000 camels.
They always said
It's
that's what the Bedouins were doing, right? That they were raising herds out in the various spots in the desert.
That makes a lot
Yeah,
of
I
sense.
think you're right, Rob. And it's a little bit comical, because the Bedouins were pushed out. They started as good farmers, and then they were pushed out into the desert, and the only way to subside themselves in the desert is with these animals that can live on nothing, and they become the key to the war being won. I mean, without those camels, there's huge tracts of land that are still in conflict.
Having a friend that's living in Turkey right now, this was a really hard book to listen to. There still is a lot of conflict over in that area, and I think Lyle touched on it earlier in the conversation. And she doesn't always see it from that perspective. She's married to a Turkish man, so I look forward to the day that she returns to American soil, but at this point, it doesn't look like it's going to be anytime soon. So I don't know what other people's thoughts are on the current situation with Turkey and the unrest that they have over there.
From what I'm seeing of Turkey, they are primed to become a regional power, if not a super regional power at this point. As I look at the cards that are stacking up, I would say the next 20 years probably puts Turkey as a fairly dominant player in that region, and maybe stretching out into the broader region too a little bit. At least the way they're setting up their arms industry is on a huge building tear right now. Their sophistication levels are arguably equal to the Russians, and they're exporting arms at this point. Their army is I think it's at least in the top 5 in the world right now, in terms of size and capability. And they've also done some, recently they've done some expeditionary warfare, which means they're sending troops outside their own borders to go accomplish other objectives. So as I look at Turkey right now, I don't know that they'll become a great power, but they're certainly primed to become a major player in geopolitics in the next 2 decades.
I think it's interesting to think about how long that they will remain in NATO, or how long NATO itself will remain a thing, right? It seems like a very strange setup right now that they're nowhere near the North Atlantic, right?
Right.
But they've always been a historic opponent of the Russians. So, you know, fighting over these ports and access to warm water there through the Black Sea. So I think it's interesting to see how that stuff plays out. There's a lot of Turkic people inside of Russia right now. Well, now we're looking at Vance's unadorned VR hat. Yeah, in any case, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there, and it would be interesting to see if Russia and Turkey come together in some way and form you know, I almost use the word axis, but I don't mean that literally, you know.
It'll be interesting to see how those two play with each other or against each other. There's almost maybe some parallels to the German-Russian relationship in 1938, yeah. 1939, where they're right now they have some synergy, but that could change dramatically depending on how things shake out. I don't know. I think we've been blessed and cursed to live in interesting times. And a lot of this feels like a 1 century deja vu cycle.
I guess the question is, where are we at on the cycle? Are we like approaching World War I and we're gonna, you know, blow out our monetary standard and have these grand alliances and then go through some downtime and then come back with the awful conclusion? Or are we closer to that now?
I don't know. That's the $1,000 question at this point. Maybe that's the one Bitcoin question at this point.
Yeah, there you go.
It almost feels like we're in that. It almost feels to me like we're in that perfect chronology, and we are in 1918 or 19, where the global war on terror is kind of winding down, and we're going to hit this golden roaring age of some kind as this pandemic winds down, and then who knows what. But I think the parallels there are that arguably World War I wasn't bad enough to solve the problems and wasn't effective enough. And I think the global war on terror has that same connection. It wasn't bad enough. It wasn't deep enough. It wasn't effective. And so those tensions still are there, and it's going to take another major conflict to defuse those tensions. What that looks like, I don't know.
And are we set up to play the part of the Russian Empire this time around? Like, are we going to be exploded by you know, communist overthrow or something crazy like this? You know, they were taken out of the war by their by the Bolsheviks, not, you know, they weren't
right.
part of the peace.
Yeah. It pains me to say it, but I think that's either that or playing the role of the English, you know, as a declining empire.
Yeah.
That
yeah.
no longer dictates the conditions of the conflict. I think either of those are probably pretty valid forks in the path.
One positive thing to say about that is it's still pretty nice, it seems to me at least, to live in you know, in the British Isles there. Like they did not
yeah.
lose their home, they just lost all of their overseas extensions, which, you know, if we could engineer that would seem to not be terrible.
Yeah.
Do you think if T.E. Lawrence were alive and running around doing his escapades today, that he would be able to publish a book on it in the way that he did?
I think that he would, but I don't know if his book would resonate in the same way that it does in the backdrop that we have now. You know, the SEALs are always out publishing their top secret missions as soon as their feet get back on the U.S. soil, and it's a far different kind of very short-lived, non-memorable kind of literature that you see coming out of those guys. But so it would be interesting if one of them did publish a story that was very soul-searching and detailed and kind of told it all just the way it happened without really glossing over anything. But I think the cultures and morals of the country at this point are so different that I don't know if that kind of book would sell well, or become a Lindy book as this one has.
There's a segment in the book that I was astonished by. I'll be interested, Brian, Christina, Tom, your thoughts on it. When he was pretty much like when he describes his feelings seeing soldiers that were wearing uniforms and how they'd given their lives over and how like basically they were lower than a slave. Like that was a fascinating part of the book. Is this resonating with any of you?
Yeah, that was in chapter 103, Brian. That's where that was.
Oh, it was?
Yes.
Yeah, and maybe that's why that chapter kind of resonated so much too, is kind of how, you know, they were worse than this slave that he had just taken on. That, and this new slave was able to work his way up, and what he was at now was better than where he was before. He was at purpose now, where them soldiers, you know, a lot of them were just blindly following, it seemed like, and leading or doing anything else.
Yeah, referring to their bodies as being rented and that their souls were like, you know, sold already because somebody could just send them to go do it. Like we had always been explained soldiers in a very different way growing up by teachers and, you know, firemen and policemen. But that description, depending on how you look at the world, is highly accurate.
There was a good line: bodies achieve their highest ends when dissolved to manure a field.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the part of the book that left me a little deflated because these people travel to help the cause, I mean, they're doing it for the glory of their service to their country, right? Just like anybody that's in the service when they are abroad at war, it's not for the country they're going to, it's for their home country, and they're providing the service to their nation. And as soon as the conflict winds down, and even though they're on the winning side, the country that they're in does not care about them. They want them out of there, gone. You're scum. Thanks for helping me. Get out. We want this. It's not yours. It's such an empty feeling.
You know, this afternoon or this morning, just before noon, my wife and I took a drive to a site where there was one of these catastrophic wildfires on the 19th and 20th November, 85-mile-an-hour winds, and burned 90 homes and killed a lady and killed a lot of animals, pets, horses, cattle. And to be truthful with you, I had kind of an out-of-body experience in the whole thing. I've never, ever experienced that kind of devastation. I mean, there is nothing, bare dirt, not even ash. It was so hot. And I thought, you know, we are so damn lucky that we haven't experienced war and devastation to that extent on our own homeland. And that looked like a war zone. I mean, there was no people, there was nothing moving, there was no deer, no rabbits, no nothing. And for miles. And reading this book and, you know, and just finishing up and going through all this and then driving through an area like that, it touched me somehow. Anyway, that's my kind of what I had that came out of this book and how I felt seeing that.
So almost like East St. Louis then.
Yeah, probably, huh? Yeah.
You know, the scene that really struck me as the harshest was when they found out that his friend's, you know, village had been ransacked and women raped and laid out, and it was just a horrible, horrible scene. And then when he goes through and knows that he has to let the retribution happen, even though they've clearly captured all the Turkish soldiers, like there's no chance that the Turks are going to get away, but they decide to slaughter them anyway. And then they go to another group that had nothing at all to do with it, but they also had committed some pretty bad atrocities. But you see that, like, no rational person sitting outside of that would say, I want to see that, or I want to know what that's like, or hear those noises, or any of those things. And I just think the act of writing that down would be one of the scariest things in the world. It was like, I've never heard anybody describe like an actual slaughter like that before.
And he wrote it twice, didn't he?
Yeah, that's right.
Jeez.
Yeah.
That was one thing I thought about too, is like how the first version would have compared to the second version. I know it was a lot longer, but like what more detail could he have included? You know, like it was quite vivid, and I can't imagine that journey being any longer over the past 2 months.
But you know, when you read the book, you kind of figure out why he's able to sit down and write the book, and that's because the sheer force of will, right? Like, who else would have the discipline to write all
or
those damn...
maybe it was therapy to work through some things.
The interesting thing about that, though, is there's the process. There's certainly the process of therapy and writing things down, but so often when you do something or you're a part of something that's so horrific, that therapy ends up in the fireplace as soon as you're done with it. You know, it served its purpose, and you don't want anyone else to know what you did, what you thought about it, that you had your fingers in that guilt and that blood and that. I mean, you don't want society to paint you with that same brush that you've just put all this stuff out on paper. You poured your heart, your soul, and all your, we'll say, guilt out onto the pages. And you know, most guys are going to take that to the fireplace and make sure that every page burns. And he took it to the publisher and made sure every page was printed, and made sure that the population had a chance to read about what the costs were, and what that experience was like, and what, you know, it was a front row seat to somebody living in East End London, and they could buy it for $1 or whatever. And so the moral courage, to me, of him being able to not only write it down, but then make sure that it got out there and was distributed and was talked about, that to me, that's fascinating. Tells me a lot about it.
Is there anybody else in history that has that type of guts that you know of, as far as putting their story out there?
I've run across a couple of different accounts that are similar in that way, but they're not nearly as comprehensive. They would be more anecdotal, or not anecdotal, but they're more this incident happened on this day, and this is what part I had in it, but they're not an entire campaign, and you know, they're not an epic in that way. They're an afternoon, or they're a 2-day period or something like this. And I run across probably a half a dozen of them in that vein in the course of my reading over the years, but I can't think of any off the top of my head specifically. Although there is one story that came out of basically the Eastern Front that was really interesting, and it was written under a pseudonym to protect the guy's identity. He felt that there would be retribution in Germany if he was connected to that story. So even that fella didn't feel like there was, he didn't want to own the story until after he was gone, and there was no chance of retribution against him. And the entire story happens in Russia. So I mean, he was an SS member, and he did some things to get out of Russia that he didn't regret necessarily, but that were awful things. He didn't even want to own those things as a reclaimed German after the end of World War II. So it's really interesting to see this dynamic with T.E. Lawrence that does want to own it and does want to say, yes, I did this thing, and here's the people I did it with, and here's how I thought about it while we were doing it, and here's why we were doing it. I mean, he lays it all out there. And that's just, to me, the level of integrity and honor, and I don't know, there's several words probably, but it's intriguing to me.
So I want to keep with our tradition of wrapping up at an hour, and we can hang out afterwards. But as we wrap up, I want to ask one final question. Do you think that this was a true story?
I would say it was true
Well,
enough.
I bought into it that it was true.
I would say it was all mostly based on truth, and there might have been some fiction, or he might have, misremembered something, but I think to the best of his ability, he meant it to be a true story.
I felt it was true. I don't, and I really don't think there was a lot of embellishment involved with some of those descriptive actions stories that he took us through.
In the forward in my book, it sheds some doubt on a couple of different incidents in the book, and there was a couple of details that the forward disputed, and I looked for those, and as I found them in the book, I kind of questioned the writer of the forward a little bit, because I didn't see that there was an incentive there to embellish that thing, or to make that story bigger or longer, or to have a detail wrong. So I guess I tend to believe that this generally happened in the way that it was recorded.
Well, all right, guys. I am so glad that you went on this adventure with me. This is one I will not forget. So this was a really impactful book. And if you didn't get a chance to finish it, I recommend chapter 119 on is definitely worth it. You'll be able to pick up from where they're at. So moving into next month, I personally would like this next month's book to be a little bit lighter of a read, so that way I can do things that are not Lindy Book Club books. I found myself filling basically every spare moment I had with this book. So are there any suggestions? We want to do something Lindy, maybe something not quite as heavy, and we could try and choose a theme for 2021. Or we could keep it going with just the theme of it being Lindy.
So I had a thought, kind of the death recently of Chuck Yeager reminded me of the book The Right Stuff, which is, a novelization of the origins of the space program, and this quest for being the fastest man in the world. Kind of the Tom Wolfe guy that wrote Electric Kool-Aid Test, a couple other things along those lines. Or no, right that. Anyway, the right stuff. That's my pitch.
I like it.
Any other pitches?
I still can't think of the book I was thinking of this morning, Vance. I'm sorry. It's totally slipped my mind.
One thought I had was A Brave New World, and if only because I've heard it being brought up several times recently. So I know we've already read George Orwell, so maybe not the right next step, but that was one thought I had.
It's definitely different, and I think people would enjoy reading it. It'd be a pleasurable read.
I've not read it since high school, so it's far enough in the past. I'm sure there'd be something new. If you're looking for really light, there's I don't know how light it is, but there's a cartoon or comic book series, Vendetta V, that is it's topical if nothing else, and it's a cartoon format. It deals with some fairly dark societal topics, but I'd say it's 80 or 90 pages, something like that. It's maybe it's not a half-inch thick in a cartoon 8.5 by 11 format, and it deals with a dystopian kind of an England sort of a thing. It's along the lines of 1984, where they're constantly at war with somebody, but it changes depending on what the moods of the overlords are. Anyway,
I love that idea. And one thought I had, so I think there's a few people in the network that got Oculuses for Christmas or other VR systems. So what I was thinking about doing is next month, instead of doing the call on Zoom, that we do the call on a thing called Hubs. And this would be an experimental thing. But the thing that Hubs will allow us to do is people that don't have a VR headset, that have a computer, you can navigate there too. You can have an avatar. You can hear it just the same way as everybody else. And it would just be this kind of different way to engage and do the book club. Would you guys be interested in doing something like that? Or do you want to nah, let's just keep it with Zoom. That's what we're doing. You can explore somewhere else. What are your thoughts here?
Is that only on a computer you can get on it then, or that Hubs, or is it?
You might be able to get on with your cell phone. I'm not sure.
Okay. That'd be the only thing for
I'll
me,
look into that. Okay.
where I'm going to be. But otherwise, yeah, I'd be down for it.
I'd support experimentation. I mean, I think it would be nice to see if there was something that can be added, like if you were referring to something that you could perhaps actually display it to people, in this physical space, like a link or an image or quotes or something you could paste into the environment somewhere. I don't know. That'd be cool.
You were in the mountains, Vance. You should have been in the desert.
Yeah, I didn't have that option, but that was a good point.
I'd be game to try it. Go ahead, Mike.
I think the ability to maybe do screen sharing and those kind of things has some potential. I agree with Rob that, we could maybe add to this, look at it in that vein, that how can we take what we've got here and make it better and add to it and more bells and whistles, so to speak.
Well, one random aspect that I think would be interesting to experiment with is, I know, we've experienced this a little tiny bit, Vance, but the that you can gather together in physical space and you hear the people who are physically near you and not the people who are far away from you. So in a Zoom call, it's pretty much one person is talking at a time. That's it, or it's chaos. But this would potentially allow other groups to break out, maybe after the main meeting, or as part of that, I don't know, to like have smaller conversations and then maybe feedback, refined ideas to the main group or something.
Yeah, this is precisely it. The value of it is not just that we can see each other with avatars, but the sound component is what I care about on hubs. And I'd love to try it out with a group of people both on VR and on their computers. So definitely if we do this, bring your headphones because the sound makes a difference. Okay, so I'm going to try and move that forward. We'll see if everything works out okay. I'll check out your cell phone thing, Brian. That's a good point. But here's the poll. We've got 3 ideas here. We've got The Right Stuff, A Brave New World, and V for Vendetta.
While the polling is happening, what's the current, I'll say, top choice and solid choice, given 2 options for VR headsets? If a guy was going to go buy one.
The Oculus 2, the Quest, is $299. It's the one that I was wearing there. The we've not tried any of the other ones. Oculus definitely has some downsides. But that's the one that Ben, Rob, myself, Mike, I think Dwayne has. They're all Oculus. Okay.
No, I noticed that after you got yours off, I noticed you had seemed like some eye strain. You were rubbing your eyes quite a bit. Is there some?
Part of that is
that
because I can't find a rag to clean my lenses, and I'm afraid to use anything that'll scratch them. So part of it is that I'm looking through blurry lenses. But the other part of it is it's not exactly comfortable. I mean, there's a reason I took it off, and it's because if I don't have to, I'm not going to wear it around.
Sure.
But it's pretty interesting, pretty exciting stuff going on there.
If you wear glasses, I found out the hard way that if you don't have it spaced right, it'll scratch the lenses. Your lenses on your glasses will rub the lenses that you're looking through. So it's something to think about. I've resolved it now, but contacts, I don't see a problem, but
so let's wrap this up. Next month's January book club will be The Right Stuff. So this is the if Rob will throw a link onto here or later. Yeah, there we go. Then I'll put that together in AVN and we'll go from there. So guys, thanks for going on the wild desert journey with me.